Okay, so I'll continue to let people in. I'll be watching the waiting room to see if anyone else decides to join. Might have a few people filtering in late. The webinar is being recorded, so if you have to go, something happens, something comes up, we will be sending out the link afterwards as well. So don't worry about missing something if you suddenly have to leave. And I would ask that everyone keep their mic muted and turn off their video as well, at least for Marg's portion of the talk, because Marg's internet is rural Muskoka internet, so it may be hit or miss. And then you can turn it on. I'll be doing a short 10-minute talk on attracting butterflies into your gardens. So you can turn it on for that, and then for questions at the end. So for questions, we're not going to do the raise hand. I'm going to ask that everyone just type it in the chat. That seems to be the easiest and least disruptive way to do it. So if you have a question at any point, type it in the chat and we'll ask them at the very end. And that way, if you see the question already asked, you can be sure that it will be asked at the end. So I'm going to hand it over to Marg there. She'll be sharing her screen and talking about monarchs. Marg is one of our directors on the board and a very experienced biologist. So I'm very excited to be hearing her talk. Take it away.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. And as Aaron said, my internet is rural Muskoka internet, so we hope this works. If it doesn't, we do have a backup plan. So away we go. So let me share my screen. Okay, today we're going to be talking about monarch butterflies, and as Aaron said, then he will give a short presentation afterwards on attracting other butterflies to your yard. So this talk is entitled The Amazing Monarch, because monarch butterflies really are truly amazing. Okay, now we have a problem. There we go. So we'll be talking about the life cycle of monarchs, the annual cycle, their migration, the wintering grounds in Mexico, finding the wintering grounds, and their life in Mexico during the winter. And we'll talk about the population status, threats to monarchs, and some of the solutions. So starting with the life cycle of a butterfly, many of you will probably remember this from public school science. The female lays her eggs on a host plant. Each species of butterfly requires particular plant species. Some are more picky than others, but they all have at least a small range of plant species that they require. For monarchs, they're very picky. The host is any species of native milkweed, and it must be native milkweed. Imported milkweeds are not good monarch habitat. So the eggs hatch into larvae or caterpillars. The caterpillars grow, molting several times, and that the growth rate and the number of molts depends on the temperature. The caterpillar eventually creates a cocoon, or in the case of butterflies, it's more commonly known as a chrysalis. The cells grow and differentiate into the wings and antennas. It used to be thought that caterpillars were just kind of a mush of cells, and the wings and the adult parts were created during the chrysalis, but it's more recently been found that in fact the primordial cells are there to begin with in the caterpillars to differentiate into the wings and the antenna and so on. The speed of metamorphosis is also temperature dependent. They emerge as adults after 9 or 10 days. The adults depend on nectar. Milkweed is a good nectar plant, but many other plants are also good sources of nectar for the adults. The annual cycle of monarchs, many butterflies lay their eggs in the fall and they hatch out in spring in Muskoka, but monarchs migrate. They south to the wintering areas, and then they come back again, not the same butterflies, which we'll get to in a minute, but they come back again in spring. The monarchs that emerge in August in Muskoka do not become sexually mature. They enter a phase that's called diapause, which they stay in for the entire winter. And they begin southward migration anytime now. If you're out on Lake Huron, for instance, at this time of year, you'd see every couple of minutes, there'd be a couple of monarchs just drifting by southwards. And you'd probably see the same thing heading off across Lakes Ontario and Lake Erie. So monarchs, in fact, are worldwide in distribution, but it's only the North American populations that actually migrate. So this tiny little butterfly that weighs about 0.5 of a gram, or about as much as a dime, flies 4,000 kilometers to its wintering areas. And interestingly, there's no genetic difference between the populations that migrate and other populations, or at least no genetic difference that's been able to be elucidated. There are two populations of monarchs in North America. The eastern population, east of the Rocky Mountains, migrates 4,000 kilometers, as I said, to the mountains of central Mexico, leaving the north in August and September and arriving in Mexico by November. The western population winters in California, but both populations depend heavily on nectar sources during migration. There have been studies that show that the nectar in the wintering areas is lower quality than what they get in migration. So not dissimilar to migrating birds, they fatten up during migration. The wintering areas are in the transvolcanic mountains of Mexico, west of Mexico City, 2,400 to 3,600 meters above sea level, or about 8 to 11,000 feet above sea level. So it's very high and very cool in the winter. The wintering areas are dominated by Oyamel fir, a species related to our balsam fir, called Abies religiosa, because of the way that the new vegetation grows in the spring. It looks like a Christian cross at the end of the branches when they're growing. So it was well known early in this last century that monarchs headed off across Lake Ontario and were going somewhere and seemed to be migrating. So in the 1940s, a professor at the University of Toronto, Fred Urquhart, began tagging monarchs with the help of volunteers across North America. The tags in the picture were the original tags that were used. These particular ones were owned by and used on monarchs by one of our local teachers and amazing conservation helper for the Conservancy, Bill Dickinson, who unfortunately recently passed away. These were his tags, and you can see that they're about a centimeter. And they folded over the upper wing and were glued and held by glue on both sides. So Bill was still tagging monarchs. Bill was tagging monarchs in the late 60s and early 70s. And it took 20 years of tagging to eventually start getting returned from northern Mexico. And a gentleman named Kenneth Bruger, who was an American living in Mexico City, heard about Urquhart's work and started exploring the mountains and found the first wintering areas in Mexico. Of course, the local people knew all along that there were monarchs there, but of course, nobody really asked them. So in winter, they mostly cling on to the trees and branches, and they'll fly around on warm, sunny days. And in the course of the winter, many of them die. So I've just got a couple of videos here to show you the flying in the winter and what it looks like in winter. So these videos were taken, we took a trip to the wintering areas in 2016 in February. And these were the monarchs flying around in one of the wintering areas that we visited. Now this next video, which shows monarchs on the tree trunks. All this gray stuff that looks kind of like fungus or something like that is actually monarchs with their wings folded, clustered on the tree trunks, just clinging to the tree trunks. And you tell that there are probably hundreds of thousands of them here. The big lumps in the trees are more butterflies just clinging on. Oops. Now this is a bit of a problem. Oh, there we go. Okay, this butterfly that's quivering its wings, you might think that it's shivering to get warm, but butterflies, of course, are cold-blooded animals and they don't shiver. What it's actually doing is just reorienting its wings, trying to get the best angle for the sun to get some heat from the sun. Okay, as I said, many butterflies die over the course of the winter, and there are a couple of many natural hazards for the butterflies. One of the main ones is predation, and a secondary hazard is weather. The normal temperatures in the wintering areas in January are 5 to 15 degrees in the daytime and about 0 to -5 at night. Sometimes it snows, and the monarchs don't have too much problem withstanding those temperatures or snow. But if it rains and then freezes afterwards, when the butterflies are still wet, that's when you can have a major die-off. As many of you probably know, monarchs don't suffer too much from predation on the breeding areas because they are poisonous to most species of birds. They produce chemicals called cardenolides or cardiac glycosides, which is similar to digitalis. On the wintering areas, there are 3 main predators: black-eared mouse, the black-headed grosbeak, and the black-backed oriole. And if you find a dead monarch that has obviously been predated, you can tell which one by the remains. Together, predation is estimated to account for 10 to 50% of winter mortality. The black-eared mouse is native to Mexico. It's the only mammal that's known to eat monarchs, and the population migrates up the mountains to monarch wintering areas for the food source available in the winter. It's the main breeding season for these mice. And they eat the whole body of the monarch. If you just find a set of wings lying around, you know it was eaten by a mouse. The black-headed grosbeak doesn't occur in Muskoka, but it does nest in Canada out west. It's relatively insensitive to the cardenolides, and it will eat the entire abdomen. So you just, as you see in the picture, just the thorax and the wings may be left, and those just the forewings. As you can tell from the person holding the butterfly, it was pretty cold. Black-backed oriole is a species that is native to Mexico, in fact endemic to Mexico. It doesn't occur in any other country, and it reduces its intake of the cardenolides by slitting the abdomen and eating the contents. So in this butterfly in the picture, you can see the abdomen is still there, but it's been slit open and there's not much left of it. So together, the grosbeak and the oriole are responsible for somewhere between 7 and 44% of winter mortality. As spring approaches, the day length gets longer, the temperatures get warmer, and the monarchs start to sexually mature. they're mostly affected by day length, which is similar to migratory birds are affected by day length that encourages them to start thinking about migrating north. You can tell the difference between the sexes in monarchs from the venation. The males have, on the top picture, narrow veins and the two black spots, which are pheromone or breeding hormone sacs on the wings, hormones that they send out to attract females. The females have wider veins and no pheromone sac. They mate in Mexico, and the female stores fertilized eggs until they arrive in Texas or the other southern states, Louisiana, and so on. There, they lay eggs on several species of milkweed. The eggs hatch, develop into adults, and the adults, the generation of adults that flew from Mexico dies, and the next generation is what continues north. They arrive in Virginia, Kansas, North Carolina by late April. They breed again on milkweed, and the next generation continues north. Sometimes they again arrive in Ontario by late May, but the main arrival in Ontario is in June and July, which is the third or fourth generation from Mexico. So that early slide where I said they migrate to Mexico and return in the spring, it's not the same butterflies that return in the spring. It's their great and possibly great grandchildren that come back. So as you saw from that picture of the monarchs clinging onto the trees, counting monarchs is not really a feasible operation. The best estimate of population in the wintering areas is somewhere between 20 and 50 million per hectare. And a hectare is 2.5 acres. So this was estimated after a deadly snowstorm followed by, probably rainstorm followed by freezing and a snowstorm in 2002. They counted 2,241 dead monarchs in 1 square meter of dead monarchs after the storm, and there were many more still in the trees above. So since you can't actually count monarchs, the wintering population is expressed as hectares occupied. And each year, the Mexican government does a survey of the monarch wintering areas and estimates how big the population is. Several years ago, population was down considerably, and monarchs were put onto the species at risk list in several countries as a species of special concern, which is the lowest level of species at risk, but it does indicate that there's a problem and they could become threatened or endangered if the issues that are affecting them are not reversed. So the recovery goal is a consistent winter population covering at least 6 hectares. That happened in 2018-19. There were 13 separate colonies covering 6.05 hectares altogether, including one previously unidentified colony, which was great. But in the next couple of years, population was down again. So the major threats are weather, which is a natural hazard, and normally one would not be too concerned about a major weather event, but it's an added threat when populations are already low. The biggest problems are habitat loss in winter from illegal logging, and in summer from genetically modified corn, or Roundup Ready, which is a Monsanto trademark for corn that is resistant to glyphosate, which is the main herbicide that is used. It's commercially called Roundup. So the weather effects, as I mentioned, it's more of a problem when the populations are low. The big storm in 2002, where they estimated the number of monarchs in the wintering areas, caused some depletion of the population the next year, but it quickly recovered. The year that we went to Mexico and saw these monarchs, after the visit to the wintering area I showed in the video, that night was a major, major storm. High winds, a lot of rain, and by the morning it was snowing. Power was off everywhere, but it was snowing. And in fact, our guides were just amazed. They had their cameras out taking pictures because they couldn't believe the amount of snow. And it also had an effect on the population. It was down probably about the same amount the next year as it had been after the 2002 event, and down again the following year. And then there was a recovery. So the winter habitat was, as I said, the main threat to the winter habitat is illegal logging. And in the early 2000s, the World Wildlife Fund got involved with protecting winter habitat for monarchs. And one of their major efforts was to increase ecotourism, which is quite successful, but it's only lasts for 2 or 3 months of the year. So the Don Bruno Hotel is one of several hotels in San Juan Mechanique, which is the little town where we stayed when we were looking at the monarchs. There are local guides. There are locals that they rent out their horses so that people don't have to walk up these hills at 11,000 feet, which many people probably would have a lot of difficulty doing. And the lower left picture here that's the current tag that's being used. And local people will sift through the dead monarchs on the ground, find ones that are tagged, and sell them to tourists. Now, each of those tags has a reporting address on it. So hopefully people who buy them will do that and report back. On our trip, there was a young woman who was a teacher in Minnesota, and she bought several of them to take back and talk to her classes about. So, efforts to combat illegal logging. The oyamel fir is a valuable and in-demand wood. So the Mexican government has passed laws against logging of the wintering areas, and they do patrol the sanctuaries, but they can't be everywhere all the time. You may not be able to see this too well because our pictures are over part of it, but the picture on the left is 1 year. The picture on the right, which has a big patch of forest removed, is a year later that was illegally logged. To combat illegal logging, the World Wildlife Fund began a program of tree nurseries and tree planting. The oyamel firs grow very quickly, and they can be ready for harvest in 10 or 15 years. So the intent is to flood the market and reduce the value of poached wood, which seems to have been at least partially successful, but there still is illegal logging, as was shown in that previous slide, which is from 2016, 2017. Summer threats, as I mentioned, Roundup Ready corn. The heart of monarch summer habitat is in the U.S. breeding range, and where you have miles and miles of cornfields looking like the picture on the right, which are, if they're treated with, excuse me, they are the Roundup Ready corn, which can be treated with glyphosate or Roundup without dying, but it kills the herbicides. So where previously there would have been, in a field like this, there would have been a lot of corn, but there'd still be milkweed scattered through that could be used by monarchs. So for many years, the US claimed that the problem was in Mexico in the wintering grounds, but as Mexico increased their patrols and were doing their very best to control the illegal logging, the US was forced to acknowledge that perhaps there was a problem in the summer as well. So now there are multiple programs of planting milkweeds on roadsides and other areas that are not used for agriculture. So the future of monarchs. The bad news is that illegal logging is still occurring. But the good news is that the 2016 storm didn't do as much damage as feared. More milkweeds are being planted. There has been a recent year of 6 hectares of wintering habitat. And perhaps the best news is that they are insects. If they have the right conditions, they can increase in numbers rapidly. And this summer has been particularly effective or particularly good for breeding monarchs. There have been a lot of them around, and hopefully they will have good migration weather and will make it south in large numbers. One thing I might just add is that I've been hearing on the radio recently about people doing captive rearing of monarchs. On a large scale, captive rearing is not a good idea. People who want to take in 10 or 15 caterpillars and watch them grow, that's great. But it can take as little as 2 generations for deleterious genes to make their presence known in captive breeding. So captive breeding, I don't think they do it as much anymore, but monarchs were very popular as for butterfly releases. For example, for the Hospice Muskoka used to do a butterfly, still does, I think, do a butterfly release. They're not using monarchs anymore. But the captive bred monarchs, which are released, if they're released early in the season, they can interbreed with the wild populations and introduce genes that are not good for the population. The other thing about captive breeding is that there was a study that was done on monarchs that had been taken into captivity. It was actually for a parasite study, but a large number of monarchs were taken into captivity. They were ones that were determined not to have parasites were marked and released again, but they'd been brought up in captivity. And when they were released, they were smaller than the wild monarchs, and fewer of them made it to Mexico. So captive breeding is not really a solution to the reduction in population. Okay. If you're interested in getting more information on monarchs, the website called journeynorth.org. It's not just monarchs, it covers hummingbirds and several other species, but it has lots of really good information. And with that, I'll turn it back to Aaron, and if there are any questions, or maybe Aaron's going to do his butterfly gardening, his short butterfly gardening presentation first.
Yes, thank you so much, Marg. Very, very informative. So I will do a short gardening talk on butterfly gardening, probably only about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions on either of the topics or both, however people would like to ask them. So again, you can ask your questions in the chat. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. And let me just... Okay, so I think that should be just the single slide. Yes, good. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the other butterflies that we get in Muskoka and attracting them. So the butterfly pictured right here is a great spangled fritillary, which is fairly common, probably the most common fritillary species that we get in Muskoka. And you're going to be seeing them probably about 2 weeks ago was when a large number of them were out. And this one is, I believe the plant it's feeding on is common bone set. Though I could be slightly incorrect, but that's what it looks like. So I'm going to talk about how to attract not just monarchs, but some of the other native species that we have in Muskoka. So how many species of butterfly do we have? There has been 79 species recorded so far, which is significantly more than I thought when I started, studying butterflies. I thought, oh yeah, there's monarchs and swallowtails, and that's about it. But we actually have 79 species in total, or at least that have been recorded. And I have a iNaturalist project on the butterflies of Muskoka, so I'm constantly keeping up with that to see if there's any new species that have been reported. And so this little guy is an Arctic skipper. They're one of the first ones that we see in the year. So they're just after mourning cloaks and Compton tortoiseshells. And they're quite a small butterfly. You might even think it's a moth because it's quite small, but nice and orange. And when they kind of spread their wings, they have very interesting patterning on it. So lots of butterflies that we can be also attracting to our yards outside of just monarchs. And so our 5 most recorded butterflies, and this is using iNaturalist data as well. So this is data that the butterflies have been photographed and identified by someone skilled in butterfly identification. So the top one is Monarch. Most people that are photographing butterflies are usually photographing a Monarch. It's a gorgeous butterfly. It's one of everyone's favorite. So obviously they're going to have one of the most recorded. Now that doesn't mean they're the largest numbers we have. It's just the species that most people are photographing. And larger species are there's going to be a bias towards larger species in our butterfly reporting because they're easier to photograph and easier to see. Then we get down to the white admiral, which is a black butterfly with a white stripe on the edge of its wings. Again, probably a fairly common one that most people have seen. And then the Canadian tiger swallowtail, a gorgeous yellow and black butterfly. And those top 3 are ones that most people have seen or at least are somewhat familiar with, probably. And then we kind of get down into some of the less well-known butterflies. The northern crescent, which is the butterfly that's photographed right here. And they're a much smaller butterfly, but they're quite numerous. So we have a number of about 4 or 5 crescent species in Muskoka. And the northern crescent is our most numerous one. And you'll kind of see them feeding in almost every field. And you'll see many of them. They're quite a numerous butterfly. Can be somewhat tricky. The females can be a little tricky to identify. But the males, if you get a good photo of the males, they're very easy to ID to species. And then we have Compton tortoiseshell, which is one of our earliest butterflies you might see. And they're a brown and black butterfly like the northern crescent, but slightly larger. And they have a couple white patches on the tops of their wings. So again, we have like the top 3 are ones that you've probably heard of or seen. But then as soon as we get out of that, we get into some really interesting ones. Not that the first 3 aren't interesting, but interesting in that not as many people are recording them. So this somewhat bad photo is a Milbert's tortoiseshell, which we had an incredible hatch of this year. Prior to this year, I think it had been recorded twice in Muskoka. And for about a week in early June, I was seeing 3 or 4 a day. So a very, very good hatch of Milbert's tortoiseshell. But how do we attract these 79 species? How do we attract some of these rare species or species that just aren't recorded as much? And there's some pretty easy things you can do in your garden, in your yard, to make sure you can attract them. So plant native plants. This very sad looking garden is a butterfly garden I just planted this year. And it's all native plants, and it's host plants for specific butterflies. So the tall plant that you're seeing kind of just right of center in the photo is a white turtlehead, which is the only native host plant we have for the Baltimore checker spot. I have some pearly everlasting in there. There's some golden Alexander. There's some wild bergamot. So all native plants that are host plants for specific butterflies. And I'm going to go over some more of the specific host plants for each butterfly later. But butterflies are very specific in what they eat and what their young eat. So making sure you have the right plant is going to increase your chances significantly in what butterflies you're attracting and how many butterflies you're attracting. the other thing you can do is provide food. So this is a shot of my mother's garden, and many of these pink flowers are non-native, but butterflies need nectar to survive. And a lot of the non-native ones are native in other parts of North America. There are some Asian ornamentals in here, but any sort of nectar that butterflies can feed on is going to be enough for them. The nectar is not the specific thing they need for the butterflies. The host plants are specific for their caterpillars. So you have to have a mix. And often a lot of the host plants are flowering, so they do provide nectar. But if you have just the host plants, you'll get the caterpillars on them, but the butterflies, you're not going to be able to enjoy them in the yard because they're going to have to look for another place to potentially get a lot of nectar. So just because you want to attract butterflies doesn't mean you need to rip up every non-native species in your garden. It just means you need to plant more native species and have flowering plants. And native plants are great for other species too. This is a photo of a hummingbird moth. I believe it's a hummingbird clearwing is what the ID that I settled on. And this is spotted Joe Pyeweed that it's feeding on. So native plants aren't just great for butterflies, they're great for all kind of species. We have moths are also like butterflies and hyperspecific. And there's 3,000 species of moths in North America. So if you want moths like this and some other really gorgeous moths, native plants are great for, you know, any sort of species, whether it's birds, whether it's moths, butterflies, ants, bees, kind of everything relies on native plants, because when monarchs are, you know, migrating north, they're looking for what they would normally get in Muskoka, not, you know, what they would get if they flew all the way to Asia. So native plants are fantastic for any sort of species that you're looking for. And the more that you plant, the more you're going to see in your gardens and in your yards. So to not make this too long, because I said 10 minutes, nice and short. So a few good native plants. And this is what I did is I went into my project on iNaturalist and said, what butterflies do I want in my yard? And I selected about 10 species that I thought I'd really like to see that in the yard. I'd like to be able to attract it. So milkweed is a fantastic species, or for all species, specifically for monarchs, but any sort of species of milkweed is great. So swamp milkweed is one that's less known. Common milkweed is the one that most people know of, but swamp milkweed is also used by monarchs, and they will lay their eggs on there, and the caterpillars will feed on swamp milkweed. Butterfly milkweed, although it's not technically native to Muskoka, it's native to like Simcoe County, and it will survive in Muskoka. So that's another one you can plant, and it's another gorgeous milkweed. Violets are great for fritillaries. So if you're looking to attract fritillaries, finding a few native violets are absolutely fantastic. I just planted 10 in my butterfly garden. So I'm hoping to get any number of fritillaries there. And we have about 5 species of fritillaries, 5 or 6 in Muskoka. So you're not just, you know, attracting the great spangled fritillary, you might get the Atlantis fritillary or Aphrodite fritillary or silver spotted fritillary. And then if you're looking to attract some of those Arctic skippers, northern crescents, native grasses are great. So native grasses and sedges are host plants for skippers. Some skippers are more specific than others. Our leaf skipper, our tawny edge skipper, there's several other species of skipper, probably about 10 species of skipper, most of them like grasses. And you can look into specific native grasses that they might like. So that's a fantastic thing to plant. So maybe take out some of the ornamentals, plant something like Canada bluegrass or another native species. And then some are hyper specific. So general grasses are great for skippers, but Baltimore checker spots are specific only to white turtlehead. That's the only native plant that can survive in Muskoka that they would use. And there are several other species that are specific to families or specific species of plants. The Chrysalis arctic, which is a species of elfin butterfly, is specific to nettles, so stinging nettle or Canada clearweed. There's about 4 species in the nettle family that it can feed on. Painted ladies and American ladies are specific to Fabiaceae, the pea family. So Pearly Everlasting is an example of that. So it does require a little bit of research. It requires a little bit of seeking things out. But you can greatly increase, like if you like seeing monarchs, I can guarantee you'll like seeing other butterflies. So you can kind of help out all our species of butterflies and our moths by looking to plant native species and providing just better habitat for them. So I'm going to open it up for questions. This species of butterfly is the bog hopper. It's specific to cranberry. It really likes cranberry fens and bogs. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll open it up to questions. So just write in the chat and I'll pass them on to Marg or myself. And if you don't know how to get the chat up, it should be down, like there's a participants tab and a chat. Some of them are under maybe reactions. Each app is slightly different, but the other alternative is you can also just unmute and ask your question if you'd like, if you can't figure out where the chat is. But not seeing any.
Well, I'm seeing one that it looks like maybe they sent it directly to me.
Okay.
It says, when I went to the wintering area, walking in, our guide told us that the horse urine in the streams was a real problem. Have those horseback tours being banned? That's very interesting. I don't know. They didn't mention that when I was there in 2016. So what year were you there? This is from Ginny.
Probably about 14 years ago.
Well, that long ago.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting because they didn't mention that at all when we were there, and there were definitely horses. But maybe they've changed the routing because we certainly, to my recollection, weren't anywhere near any streams.
Yeah, we hiked up. I mean, quite an elevation, obviously, and it was a sunny day, so it was ethereal. It was lovely.
Sounds like you had good weather, better than we did.
Yes, we were very lucky. Now, are the butterflies that make it here, which ones are called the Methuselahs? Are they the ones that end up here?
I don't know. I've not heard that term, but I would suspect that they're the ones that fly to Mexico because they live the longest. The ones that fly to Mexico live about 9 months, and the others will only live with weeks. Okay.
Yeah, it was actually our bus driver who gave us the most information.
Okay, so I've got a couple questions. I'm going to lump kind of 2 together. Is milkweed considered a noxious weed? And then also, how can we encourage road maintenance not to mow the milkweed on the roadside? So I can answer the noxious weed. It is not a noxious weed.
But it used to be.
Yes, it used to be considered that. It is no longer. It will grow anywhere it can. So it can have a habit of taking over places if it's left to run rampant. But often what will happen is a patch will show up. That patch will stay in the same area for a couple of years. It'll die back and then it'll show up in another section. So I mean, you can pull it if it's really invading your garden, but I recommend keeping it. And I don't know if you can speak on encouraging road maintenance to not mow the milkweed on the side.
Well, just another milkweed used to be on the noxious weed list because it affects the taste of milk. So when it was growing in meadows where cows were grazing, the farmers were unhappy about that. So, but it was on the noxious weed list for quite a long time. Happily, they've taken it off. No, roadside mowing is an issue. I know that the towns have been approached and said, no, we have to do that for sight lines and mowing milkweed and everything else. So, I mean, if you're walking along the road and you see monarch larvae on milkweeds along the roadside, just pick them up and put them on a milkweed that's in a safer location.
We have someone mentioned in Huntsville Township, I simply requested them not to cut the roadside grass on our property and they complied. So maybe reaching out to your town or township, some might say yes, some may not.
Yeah.
It probably depends a little bit on where your property is. And then the other question, does it harm the butterfly's wings if you happen to touch them?
It's not a good idea. Their wings are they have scales on them, and if they're handled too roughly, you can pull the scale, rub the scales off, which makes it harder for them to fly. So ideally, don't touch the wings. They do, if they're when they're marking the butterflies, that they would. What they do when they mark them is they trap them and then they cool them down so they don't flap around, and hold them by the thorax to put the tag on. So ideally, don't touch the wings if you can possibly avoid it.
Yeah, but brushing up against it accidentally is not gonna kill it. I've grown mostly yellow native plants, maybe. My most favorite is the cup flower. I have many butterflies and lots of birds. Has anyone else grown it? I can say we have cup plant at my house and it's awesome. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Marg.
No, I don't.
Yeah, so we have it. The finches love it. Our finches are constantly in there. I actually have seen warblers taking caterpillars out of them. The only thing that I will caution people of is it can spread fairly easily. Our single patch has since migrated around the yard quite significantly, but it's one of the best plants for providing food for a large number of birds and insects. So I recommend cup plant. Just if you plant it, be aware that it may start traveling around the yard and you might have to cut it back and pull some up. And then another follow-up on the mowing, we wrote a letter to Bracebridge and they wrote back that they are working on a program as you let them know where the milkweed is. I think I've heard about this program. What they're doing is identifying sections of the road where milkweed and other important plants are located and attempting to cut them later after the flowering and seeding is done. So I think the best, if you want to protect monarchs and keep the milkweed from getting mowed over, if you have a patch that you know of that has monarchs on it, contact the town and say, I've got a section that I don't want mowed. Like, I can stake it out if you'd like, but start a conversation with the town, because since the town are the people that are mowing it, that the more people kind of pushing and letting them know that they care about this kind of stuff is gonna create, put the onus on them and create a lot more pressure to have them do it. One voice is not a lot, but 30 voices is a little bit more significant. I'm not seeing any other questions coming. I'll give people just a minute maybe to add anything if they have stuff. But if not, very happy to have you, Marg. Fantastic talk. I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else did. And we'll be posting the presentation online as well, hopefully later today or likely at some point this week. And we'll send out the link to everyone and you can share that with whoever you'd like. And I know there was a bit of lagginess in the videos. So we'll try to get a couple links as well to let you watch those too. So thank you so much, Marg, and I hope everyone enjoyed. And enjoy the rest of the day despite the weather. There's a little period where you can get out. Have a great day, everyone.